So the second place that the story takes us to is a place called in John the Stone Pavement, or Gabbatha, and it contained on it the judgment seat, the judge's seat, where Pilate sits to cast judgment on Jesus. So I'm reading from chapter 19, verses 1 to 16. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claims to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You have no power over me, if it were not given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So there's two statements from Pilate. Verse 14, "Here is your king," he says as he presents Jesus to the Jews, which enrages them. And then in verse 6, "Here is the man." And to both statements, the response is, "Crucify him." And so John sets up the choice. Jesus is a man, and Jesus is a king. But can he be both? And he wants us to accept that this king is also a person, a man, the man Jesus. There's a huge amount in just that little statement, "Here is the man." The first thing is that he's a man like us. He is a person like us. Jesus identifies with our need for healing, our need for liberation, our need for peace, our need for forgiveness. And he's caught up in the same noisy, violent world that we are. He stands in the middle of that same noisy, violent, chaotic world that we do too. And so he feels what we feel. He feels pain in his body, physical pain. He feels the pain of separation. John doesn't include it, but in the other Gospels it talks about Jesus' separation from the Father and his cry from the cross. So he feels relational pain. And he feels the pain of ridicule and scorn. He feels emotional pain. Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3 puts it like this: "He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering, like one from whom men hid their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not." So he's a man that identifies with us, but he's a man who also is for us. He represents us at the seat of judgment. He represents us at this crisis of world history as we and he are caught up in the battle of the principalities and powers. And he represents our brokenness, our frailty, our sin, and our sinned againstness. I went to a conference once about the theology of the cross. And the title for this day of teaching was called, Why Did Jesus Have to Die? And when I got there, as you do in these things, I got a name badge. And I've always kept this name badge because it seemed to me that this name badge encapsulated the answer to that question, why did Jesus have to die? Because it just said on it, and I hope you can see it, why did Jesus have to die? Paul Bradbury. And in many ways, we could insert our own name there. Why did Jesus have to die? And we insert our own name because Jesus represents each one of us as he stands in judgment on the stone pavement. He represents us individually, but he represents the whole of humanity collectively as he stands in that place. Isaiah chapter 53, again, verses 4 to 5. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Here is the man, or in Latin, Ecce Homo, and that was the title of a piece of art by Mark Wallinger, a statue that stood on the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square in 1999, and it seemed to capture people's imagination and attention as this very simple, very serene statue of Jesus stood on the fourth plinth in the middle of a busy, noisy, fast-moving city. It seemed to capture the loneliness, the vulnerability, and yet the humanity of Jesus at the heart of everyday life. Here is the man. Here is your king. At the same time, Jesus is one of us, a human being, standing in the midst of the chaos and noise and sometimes craziness of our lives. And at the same time, he's our king, the king of a new kingdom that will last for all eternity.